So welcome back, everyone. Now we're back with the neuro-inspiring continual learning section. So for me, I'm really happy to present Cristian and the work that he's been doing so far. So Cristian is a PhD in computational cognitive neuroscience from the Free University of Brussels. He did a postdoc at Gwent University and at Brown University. His research are mainly in the areas emerged from the intersection between neuroscience and AI, and particularly his work focused on development of neural networks inspired by brain function and mechanism. He is currently a researcher in the National Center of Artificial Intelligence, CENIA, as you have now seen in the slide. So please, Cristian, thanks for being here, and I'm happy to hear the talk.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you for the introduction. And also thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this nice unconference on continual AI, which has this very funky format where we're just discussing of going around the world like that. So it's quite interesting. So initially, I actually had sent this title to the organizers, which is how can neuroscience help us overcome catastrophic forgetting in machine learning? And I took sort of the liberty to slightly change the title. And now it's called Catastrophic Forgetting from the Perspective of Neuroscience. And I did that simply because it just suits my narrative a bit better, right? And so what I want to convey in this talk is that the concept of catastrophic forgetting is to some extent incomplete from the perspective of neuroscience, right? So what do I mean by incomplete? So let me illustrate that with this example of maybe playing tennis, right? So when I'm playing tennis, I need to learn a set of rules, maybe some cognitive representations that are relevant for playing tennis, and most likely some motor representations that allow me to be proficient in playing tennis. And I don't know about the country you live in right now, but in Chile, there's this other sport that's like very related to tennis, which is booming, right? Which is this sport. Everybody is playing paddle tennis in Chile right now. So from the perspective of neuroscience, really, it's not simply that I have to learn how to play tennis, then I can learn how to play paddle tennis without forgetting how to play tennis, basically, or vice versa, right? I think there's other key ideas that are at stake from the perspective of neuroscience. And one of them is quite obvious, which is this idea of how can I generalize information from knowing how to play tennis in order to get maybe a head start in how to play paddle tennis, right? So the first question is, how can I use task A representations or the representations that I need to play tennis that can help me to learn task B representation or playing paddle tennis, right? And so this sort of hints to this notion of sample efficiency for AI systems, right? So that's the first question. Then the other question is how and when should I switch from task A to task B? So, right. So I guess us humans, when we wander in our natural environments, we're not getting task IDs for free, right? Nobody's telling us how to structure our environment and the tasks in our environment, right? So this is another important question from the perspective of neuroscience. And I'm going to be speaking about these two questions, and I'm actually going to start with the second one. So how and when should I switch from task A to task B? Right? And I think the AI community can benefit from some research that has been done in cognitive neuroscience, and in particular within the domain of adaptive learning, right? So I'm going to explain what adaptive learning is via this behavioral neuroscience task that focuses on specifically trying to understand adaptive learning. So this task, maybe let me put my pointer, it will be easier. There you go. So in this task, which is called the helicopter task, which was developed by some colleagues, you can think of it as a helicopter that is hiding behind a bunch of clouds here, right? And the helicopter drops bags of money. And the basic task of a human subject is to locate a bucket, so infer the location of a bucket in order to collect as much money as possible, right? So they have to maximize their reward in this task. But unbeknownst to the subjects, from time to time, the location of the helicopter changes, right? So there's change points during the tasks, right? And so the participants, they have to update the location of the bucket as a function of this change in hidden state, right? And so to sort of account for the human behavior in these tasks, people have developed normative models where basically the location of a bucket depends on a prediction error, which is updated with a adaptive learning rate. And I don't want to sort of, talk too much about these models, because I think what's interesting from the perspective of AI is what's happening at the neural level. And so what's happening when you put people in the scanner, which are doing this task, is that if you can take snapshots of brain activity throughout this task, and you can sort of record this brain activity in these vectors, which represent like brain patterns at a specific instance in time, what you observe is that when there's a change point, so when the location of the helicopter changes from one point to another, the similarity between those brain patterns are actually reduced strongly, right? And usually what we use is actually a measure of dissimilarity, so 1 minus the correlation between these vectors. And you can see that basically at the moment of these change points, these brain patterns are actually highly dissimilar, right? So this kind of suggests that what humans do is that they sort of recruit novel populations of neuron, or at least to represent different contexts in different subspaces of activation space, right, of the brain activation space. So that's quite interesting, right? So I have a context A, I represent it with some representation, brain activation, and then I have a context B and I represent it in another way, right? And on top of that, what the neuroscience literature can tell us is that flexibly sort of switching between those context representation, or you can think of them as task representations as well, really requires another signal, right? And in this study from Mike Halas's lab, they actually suggest that this signal might be actually some form of gating signals coming from the basal ganglia, which are subcortical structures, and in particular a substructure called the thalamus, right? So in this study, I'm not going to dwell too much on exactly what the rats are doing in this study, but basically they have to do 2 different tasks, and these tasks switch from task A to task B to task A to task B, right? And what happens is that when you suppress the activation of thalamus neurons, at the moment of the task switching, the rats, they sort of behave in a random way, right? So they don't really understand that there's a context switch, and they sort of behave in a very random way. And so we kind of use these 2 empirical findings to motivate a neurocomputational model, which tells us how the brain and when actually how the brain might implement a task switch, but also when it implements a task switch, right? And so the main, say, module of our neurocomputational model really sits here on top on the yellow area. And it's represented by a recurrent neural network whose activation dynamics are governed by the following differential equation. And this equation has 2 important terms. The first one, it's a symmetric matrix, right, which sort of encodes attractor states, which you can think of abstract representations of states or contexts or tasks. Really doesn't really matter here. But it also has another important term, which is governed by an asymmetric matrix, which sort of tells you from which state I should move to. So it tells you the direction of jumping from one state to another, right? But this term, this asymmetric matrix, is weighted by this psi factor, which you can think of an online measure of prediction error, right? So whenever my model is doing a prediction, if that prediction is correct, basically this term doesn't exist, and I'm maintained in a given context or task state or whatever. But when my model actually produces an error, this part of the equation that governs the activation of the recurrent neural network sort of turns on, and I switch from one state to another. So I start recruiting other neuronal populations that now allow me to represent this novel state with other basically neurons, right? And so what this model really allows us to do is sort of structure information that comes sequentially in a very specific way. So for instance, if I replicate now a helicopter task where the location of the helicopter is in a fixed position here, say the 50th position, doesn't really matter what that means, but, and then it jumps to location 150, and then it jumps a second times to location 250. What happens is that as long as I am in a stable state where the prediction of my model is actually a correct prediction, well, I just encode this sort of state action pairing in a given part of a projection matrix from the task representation to the action representations, right? But when my prediction is wrong, and then I get supervised by the fact that, well, actually the bags dropped in another place of the visual scene, I can now push activation in the recurrent neural network to another part of the subspace, and I can now encode this novel task with another part of my projection matrix, right? And when I changed again from say a second location to a third one, I can furthermore sort of start structuring my environment in this weight matrix space, right? So this is quite interesting because it led Linda and Matt to propose maybe a different idea about what adaptive learning is, right? And it's not simply just a parameter that just increases when there is high prediction error and decreases when there's no prediction error. But the idea here is that basically adaptive learning might be some form of structured learning in time, right? So when I have these different tasks where I have switch of context or switches in state action contingency, what I basically am representing is these transition probability functions, right? And I think there's a direct link that can be made from this sentence that adaptive learning is structured learning in time for continual AI. So I think actually continual learning is structured learning in time as well. And this idea, I think, is at the core of this work by Ali Hummus, which is a collaborator of ours, that was recently published in iClear. So this is a model / algorithm that was proposed by Ali, and I'm going to try to unpack what he proposed in this slide, right? So Ali used a collection of tasks, which is known as the neurogym, which are behavioral neuroscience tasks, right? But that's just a detail here. And what the algorithm of Ali does is that basically you can sort of, you know, unpack these tasks in a sequential way, and you can start learning one task, right? So there's inputs and outputs to these tasks, and you can use basically simple, you know, backpropagation to teach a recurrent neural network to actually solve a given task, right? But once you've solved the task and you've reached a specific criterion, you now switch to another task, right? And the accuracy drops strongly. And what this algorithm does is that it actually switches from learning a given task, so implementing weight updates in the model to actually learn a task, to actually now having switches in a latent embedding in a latent embedding layer. So the layer, what this layer does is actually it sort of gates information in the recurrent neural network. So I have a given task, I actually activate, I have a task ID associated to this task, so I activate the one hot encoding representation of this latent embedding vector. And so I'm going to solve to some extent the task in a specific subspace of my recurrent neural network. And when now I have to do another task, I activate another representation in this latent embedding, and I'm going to solve this new task in another subspace of this network. But what's interesting is that when I do this sequentially, I can sort of now use information. So I use the gradient, I fix these weights, and I just push the gradient in activation space of the latent embedding. And this latent embedding is going to find a configuration which is best adaptive to solve my novel task, right? And so this is sort of illustrated here. I can pre-train the model with task IDs, right? And once I don't have the task IDs anymore, I just simply use, and I'm going to unfold these, you know, tasks over time. So I'm going to simply use the error at the output to sort of find the via gradient descent, basically to find the most adaptive state of the latent embedding layer. Sorry, I'm going to move this because I cannot see half of my screen. There you go. And so what this shows is that, okay, so I can actually only use information in this latent embedding, and I can already do very good at specific tasks without having more learning involved. So I pre-train the model with specific tasks, right? I give one task, I allow for the error to move the activation space in this sort of gating layer, and I can already see that with a specific, iterations, I can increase the accuracy of a given task, right? So these are already, of course, this is pre-trained. But what's really cool about this model is that you don't need to pre-train it, basically, right? So, doesn't move. There you go. You don't need to pre-train this algorithm. So basically what you can do is, for instance, allow for, say, in this case, 5 tasks, right? So allow for 5 tasks to unfold over time, and the recurrent neural network just simply sequentially learns this task. And once you've done this first initial sequential learning, you can start turning on the algorithm of switching between weight updates and latent updates, right? As I just explained you. And what you start observing is that there's some specific configuration states that are starting to emerge from this latent embedding layer in order to sort of gain a head start to solve the given task at hand, right? And you observe that as you propose this algorithm over time, you start to reduce the amount of weight updates that you're doing. And as well, you start to also maybe reduce as well the latent updates that you're doing to reach a given criterion for the task at hand, right? Now, the other very interesting thing about this model and algorithm is that it can take advantage of the information it has via the latent embedding layer and sort of generalize to tasks that it has never seen already, right? So what I'm showing you in this graph is the accuracy. So if I have 5 sequential tasks, is the accuracy on the last task, a task that hasn't been trained yet in the model. And what you're observing here is how good am I at doing this last task with the amount of tasks I've been trained on before, right? And so you see that the algorithm of Ali really already at the second even task has an advantage over other types of learning algorithms. In the case of the third task, it can already take advantage of the configuration of that Z layer in order to sort of reuse information that has been learned in previous tasks and gain already an advantage on a task that hasn't been basically learned yet, right? And sort of that hints to the second question that I had proposed in the introduction of the talk. Oh, yeah, sorry. And obviously this sort of emerges from the fact that the algorithm is structuring information with respect to the task in a clever way, right? So some tasks are going to be, close in sort of, this is a t-SNE map of the hidden layer neurons, right? And you observe that, for instance, tasks that are really similar in terms of what they have to implement, right? So what the participants have to implement, they sort of fall in a similar space in the activation space of hidden neurons, right? And so sort of this kind of alludes to this second, so the first question actually that I had presented in the introduction, which is how can I use task A representations to help me learn task B representation? And so in neuroscience, there's this emergent, maybe I shouldn't call it emergent, I think it's quite consolidated now, framework to understand how basically neural geometries can help us understand higher order cognition, and in this case, generalization abilities of neural networks. And so the basic idea here is that if I have, let me try to simplify this. So basically, this is the work from Stefano Fusi and colleagues. If I have a given neuron here, this is the activation of a given neuron, say neuron 1, this is activation of a neuron 2, and say, for instance, neuron 1, is active with respect to some task variable, say color, for instance, and neuron 2 to noise, right? If I have a third neuron, which sort of fires with a linear combination of one or either of these two neurons, well, basically the potential task variable representations are going to fall in this hyperplane, right? And this is sort of not very good, so to speak, in the sense that I won't be able to perform any task with respect to these two variables, right? But now if this third neuron actually represents a nonlinear combination of these two other neurons, which are like task-relevant neurons, I can sort of shatter the representation of task-relevant variables, and now I can perform a higher separability of this representation and perform more tasks. But this obviously comes at a cost, right? And the idea here is that I can have high-dimensional representations, and so I can represent a lot of different variables and decode a lot of different variables, so perform a lot of different tasks, basically. But this comes at a cost of generalization, right? And on the other side, if I have a low dimensional representation, I have higher generalization, but maybe I have less specificity, right? And this idea is even better represented in this figure from this beautiful paper from Bernardi and colleagues, which show that basically there's a continuum in neural geometries, whereby on one side I can have a high dimensional representation and allow for instance, a lot of variables that, to be decoded by a linear classifier. But on the drawback of that is that obviously you have poor generalization performance, right? And on the other side of that continuum, I can have a very low dimensionality where I can maybe decode one specific abstract variable, and I'm going to have a high, sort of generalization over that variable, but I'm going to be able to perform a very few amount of tasks, right? And so if I sort of have this called parallelism to some extent, where I have on a very specific neural geometry, where I can represent, for instance, a given task on I can represent basically two contexts that actually follow a very similar geometry, and I can sort of translate this geometry to another subspace of the task activity. Then maybe I can use this sort of structure here and reuse it in another context to sort of generalize information in that other context, right? And obviously there's this sweet spot where I can take the best of both worlds, right? So I can have this form of parallelism implemented with also a little bit of, shattering dimensionalities, where I can get a lot of, decode a lot of variables, and at the same time have good generalization performance. And this idea of parallelism is at the core of another paper, a very interesting paper by Ito and colleagues, where they basically developed this CPRO cognitive paradigm. I'm not going to dwell too much over this paradigm, but the basic idea is that they sort of developed this task where a given task dependent on the combination of specific either logic rules, sensory rules, and motor rules, right? And there's 4 factors or 4 levels in each of these rules, which means that they can build 64 tasks, right? And this is quite interesting because what they could do is they could, make human participants, or in this case also a neural network, learn a bunch of these tasks and held out another set, a test set of tasks, so to speak, right? And they could assess the zero-shot inference of humans in tasks that they had never seen before, right? And what they observed is the following: is that obviously with the practice task, they could perform a very high accuracy, obviously, on the practice task. And what they could do is, sort of separate the task in cases where you had 2 rules that overlapped with the practice tasks, or only 1 rule that overlapped with the practice tasks. And these are sort of the zero-shot inference performances. And you can obviously see that, well, when there's 2 rules, when there's more information that I can reuse, basically humans do better than when there's 1 rule, right? So that's kind of expected. And the interesting thing is that they trained a neural network, a feed-forward neural network, on this task, right? So you have task context inputs, so that basically define the task at hand. You have some motor output units, which is the response that you have to give, and you have all the sensory inputs, which with respect to the task that they actually implemented, right? And they did 2 things, right? So what they did is that they first pre-trained this network with either primitives pre-training and actually simple task pre-training. So the primitives pre-training, sorry, I have a hard time saying that, is actually this idea of training the network with some, logical Boolean function, right? In the sense that if these 2 bars that you see, this is true. If you see 2 different bars in their sort of directions, this is false, and so forth. And so you can train also on color recognition and also on simple sort of motor patterns, right? And you can also, these tasks, decompose them in more simple tasks, and you can pre-train the network on this simple task. And what they observe is quite interesting, is that this parallelism score, which I had mentioned before, is some sort of geometrical representation of task relevant variables that support generalization, really increased when you were either implementing simple task pre-training and as well combining simple task pre-training with primitives pre-training. Right? And they observed that, interestingly, that when you actually combine simple task pre-training with primitives pre-training, which actually increases the parallelism score, you have also a better zero-shot performance on the CPRO task. So for the tasks that the network had never seen before, right? And on top of that, it really also helps with sample efficiency, right? The network learns much faster when you have this pre-trained version of the network. And what you can observe here is that sort of this, abstract representation, geometrical representation that supports generalization increases as a function of pre-training epochs, right? And this is also associated with an increase in accuracy, which is basically best described here by this correlation between the average parallelism score that supports generalization and accuracy in these held out tasks. Now, this is interesting, but obviously in this continuum between high dimensionality and a very low dimensionality, basically one would want to balance that depending on the task at hand, right? And this is what has been investigated by Peter Verbeek and Tom Vergutz in this paper that appeared last year, where they basically tried, and also they have some task one-hot encoding to sort of define the type of task, but they were interested in the nature of this top-down process. What would be the nature of this projection in order to sort of balance shared versus distributed representation, and that could be helpful to actually not only maximize the amount of tasks that I can learn, but also use information to generalize between the tasks, right? And so they developed this quite interesting paradigm where it's sort of a version of the Stroop task, if people know about the Stroop task. But basically the task was simple mappings between colors and responses. And you can see that, for instance, for a given task, A, B, and C, right, the responses, given the colors, are completely orthogonal with one another, right? So the task A, B, and C, they give orthogonal responses. Task D shares one component with task A, one component with task B, and one component with task C, right? And then task E is completely overlapping with task A, right? And so they tested 4 different models about the nature of this projection here, right? And so they tested one model where you could actually look, so it's basically 2 factors. So one factor was the fact that you could learn these weights versus the fact that you couldn't learn these weights. And then the other factor was that these projections could be either multiplicative or additive, right? So this led to 4 potential models, right? And what they observe is, first of all, that with the model that allows for learnable weights with multiplicative projections, right? You could best counter the effects of the catastrophic forgetting. So what you're observing here is that these are the task repetitions that unfold here on the x dimension, and on the y dimension, sorry, it's the accuracy on the task. And you observe that with this model, with the multiplicative learnable weights, you observe that you can counter best the effect of catastrophic forgetting. But what's most interesting is that when you start sort of dissecting the accuracy for a given task, specifically for all the 5 tasks in this study, well, you observe that the multiplicative learnable weights actually allow to balance these different task sets, in the sense that you have a balanced shared versus a distributed representation, in the sense that you can, first of all, represent these tasks sort of separately, but at the same time, the task D that sort of overlaps with these 3 tasks also provides a good accuracy, and task E, which is fully overlapping with task A, also has a good accuracy. And this, I think, is best seen when you look at the T-SNE map on the hidden activation especially with this this neural network, which implemented learnable multiplicative projections. And so remember that this is the sort of the color code of these tasks, where A, B, and C were fully orthogonal. D shared one representation with all of the first three tasks, and E was fully overlapped with A. And so if you look at this color code, it really makes sense when you're looking at what is being represented by this network, in the sense that A, B, and C are sort of, you know, separated to some extent, but D, that shares something with these three tasks, really sits in the middle of these three tasks. And E is to some extent fully overlapping with task A, right? Right, so I think it's time to conclude. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I guess you're okay. What I want to convey with this talk really is that just catastrophic forgetting on its own doesn't really make sense from the perspective of neuroscience, and I think everybody will agree with that, right? And even from the perspective of AI as well. And so there's two things here that I wanted to convey. The first one is that we don't get task IDs for free, right? So we need to understand when to switch from one context to another, from one task to another. And on top of that, so this might be subtended by projection from neuroscience, by projection from the thalamus, that allow you to actually recruit maybe different neural population to represent a novel task. And that might be induced by prediction errors, actually. So that's like what we propose in our work, right? And it just allows you to recruit different neuronal populations to understand that maybe there's a switch that I need to do, right? So whatever I'm doing now doesn't have to be sort of encoded in the same space as I was doing before, whatever I was doing before, basically. And in the work of Ali, really, this is taken to another level, I would argue, where on top of that, you have this sort of latent embedding layer that allows you to infer exactly on which task you are, right? Not only to infer in which task you should use, but also how you can reuse information from previous tasks to sort of gain advantage in novel tasks. So that's one thing, right? So parsing basically or structuring your environment in different tasks in a natural way. And then the other idea is that, well, you need to balance, mixed selectivity, right? So you cannot have only high dimensional representation, because this doesn't allow you to generalize very well. And you can not only have low dimensional representation, because obviously this doesn't allow you to perform a lot of tasks, right? So you need to balance that. And maybe one way, what they show in the latest work that I just talked about, is that like the nature of these projections, right? So the nature of these projections might be advantageous to have actually multiplicative learnable weights there that allow to sort of maximize the trade-off between shared and distributed representations. All right, so I think that's my cue. I want to thank, obviously, a lot of people. First, from the Nacional lab, I want to thank Matt, with whom I'm actually collaborating on this. The neurocomputational model that I presented you is actually something really fresh off the oven. We're going to submit probably the preprint in maybe 2 weeks or something like that. And also, obviously, Michael Frank and Dan. This is sort of outdated, because actually Dan is now part of the Nacional lab. And obviously the people from my previous lab at Ghent University, Tom and Peter, who I've just talked to, the model they just developed, and I just discussed about that. And obviously also Ali Hummus, who developed the thalamus stuff. And we're actually collaborating with Ali on several, future. I mean, we're basically using his algorithm to test if they can scale to larger models and foundation models. Yeah, so that's that. And obviously the funding agencies. All right, thank you.
Great presentation, Cristian. I don't know if anyone from the attendees have any question. If there is any question, there is the Q&A section, or you can raise your hand and I will be more than happy to unmute you. So I don't know if there is any questions in the QA. Not yet. So I will start with the questions, and maybe, I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, so I'm sorry about it. And maybe with this question, maybe we can start the open discussion that is just before your talk. So please, Jeremy, if you want to answer this question as well, you're more than welcome. So the question is, I mean, there are a lot of works in neuroscience that show that continual learning kind of is present. I mean, past humans will learn continually. No, it's, however, use this neuro-inspired technique in like more real kind of application where the dimensionality is higher. It's not an easy task. What do you think is? Why do you think this happens? I mean.
What do I think that when you're trying to scale these techniques? I mean, but a lot of work is actually already trying to use these techniques, right? Okay, so what's missing, in my opinion? I think one of the answers is actually provided by the work of Ali Hummus, right? So what you need to develop is actually a clever algorithm that allows you to really reuse smartly information from previous tasks, and infer what's the best sort of latent state that I can have to solve the current task at hand, right? And so I think this recurrency, so to speak, is missing in current AI models that are trying to scale, to real life environments, right? I think that's one thing. But in general, again, one issue here is how you structure your environment, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, like you don't get task IDs for free, right? We just move around the world and we create our own environment and structure it in a hierarchical, abstract way that allows you to generalize information and store information without creating interference and so forth, right? So I think these two things are maybe still missing in most models.
Thanks. Okay, so Jeremy, do you want to complement, to add something to that, so we can start the open discussion, since I don't see any questions?
I think that was a very good answer. Right now, I think the typical network that we have, they might lack, well, they're very efficient computationally, they might lack a bit of complexity that allows that allows to handle that dynamical environments, right? There's a lot of functions or a lot of details in biological neurons that are actually missing from our models. Point neurons are extremely simplified version of biological neurons, right? Same goes for the networks we use. We use mostly feed-forward weights. Sometimes we use some loops, but overall, compared to the math that is biology, this is extremely simplified and abstracted, right? There must be details in biology that we have overlooked, for now at least, that allow us to handle those cases, right?
So we actually have a question about in the chat. So let me read it for you guys. Do you see any overlap with your system? This question is for Cristian. To your system with mixture of an expert models?
Yeah, actually, it's not my work. It's Ali's work in that really sort of relates to like MOE or whatever you want to call it, models. But I think, for instance, in the work of Ali, in my opinion, it's a bit more interesting and more unified, because actually I had the discussion not too long ago with another colleague, simply because it sort of optimizes across sort of two different levels, right, at the same time, right? So this notion of having, you know, this latent embedding layer really allows you to sort of, in a very data-driven way, to some extent, allows you to really understand what are the components of previous tasks that I should use now for this novel task to maximize the accuracy on this novel task, right? And a mixture of expert models, they would do something similar to that. It's just that they sort of maybe separate it in this way, right? In the sense that you have to bring in experts as you are maybe doing a task that you're not very good at, right? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, let's hope. Okay, there is any more questions? So if there is